All right, we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about the automatic exposure control portables and the tomography, which I don't think tomography is covered in your textbook at all. So I'm going to keep things fairly general in talking about tomography, but hopefully we at least get a basic idea of how this principle can be applied. So here's my objectives. I want to talk about the impact of the automatic exposure control usage. Sometimes some texts will call it photo timer. That's actually an older form of technology that used creation of light to manipulate the exposure time, but we don't use that anymore. We use an ionization chamber, so the technical correct term for it is the AEC, or the automatic exposure control. I think for whatever reason photo timer just comes off the tongue easier. We'll demonstrate the use of the density controls, which are surprisingly complex, given that this thing is basically here to make our lives a little bit easier. We'll explain some of the limitations of it. So you've probably already seen some situations where using an automatic exposure control actually doesn't help you get the picture that you need, so that's what we're talking about. Then we'll switch gears some and we'll talk about portable machines and special considerations related to portables, because guess what? Portables have a totally different generator style than every other machine you work on, because portables are powered by a battery, so there's no need to do any rectification with portables. So they do actually require a different technical consideration. And then finally, we'll talk about tomography. And this is not CT, like computed tomography. This is straight up radiographic tomography, very similar to what they do at the dentist office, where they're taking an x-ray of your teeth and they're moving the x-ray tube while they take a single image, right? So that's what we're talking about, is tomography. So in terms of automatic exposure control and technique, this is chapter 27 in the textbook. The way that these things work is, if we look on page, says, if we go, it actually asks us to look back at chapter 8-6 real quick to see an illustration of what this device looks like, because it's briefly mentioned in there. But if at 8-6 we see, oh my goodness, yeah, this illustration of how the electrical charge is induced and stored in an electrical capacitor, right? Is that figure 8-6? 8- I'm sorry. Yeah, that's not quite right. Thank you. Okay, here we go. Yeah, 8-16. That's correct. So we have, what we have going on this illustration here is there's an x-ray that's incident on a patient. So we call that the primary beam, right? It exits the patient. We now call that the remnant beam. It's whatever still exists after that differential absorption that happened inside the patient, right? Those then, before they reach the image receptor, go through an ionization chamber, right? An ionization chamber that's measuring the amount of x-rays that are coming through it, right? So it's doing a head count on the number of x-rays that just came through the patient. And once it has enough of a head count to make a picture, it's going to stop the exposure. That's what we're talking about, an automatic exposure control. It's going to stop the exposure once it has enough x-rays that have passed through this ion chamber to make a pretty picture, right? The way that works is we have, in this illustration, A is a very, very thin ion chamber. It's normally made out of plexiglass or aluminum, something very, very thin, right? When the x-rays enter that ion chamber, they ionize gas inside that chamber. And very similar to a Geiger counter, those gas molecules are attracted, since they've been ionized, they're attracted to a negative receptor, right? So we count the number that have been ionized, right? And that number is stored in a capacitor. A capacitor just stores electrical charge, right? Once the capacitor has reached a certain electrical charge, that information is fed through what we call a thyrotron. I think I may have misspelled it on one of my slides. But it's fed through that thyrotron, which is a density controller. It allows us to set what the density of the image should be, how dark or how bright the image would be, right? And then that terminates the exposure once the appropriate exposure has been reached. So that's walking through the illustration on figure 816. So the important parts to remember to the automatic exposure control, the testable parts to it, are threefold, right, in terms of drawing the way this thing looks. It is an ion chamber, a capacitor, and a thyrotron, okay? Ion chamber, capacitor, and thyrotron. So there's some technical considerations that come out of that. All the AEC controls is the exposure time. That's all it controls, is the amount of time that the exposure is being made. All it controls is the exposure time. Once sufficient number of electrons or once sufficient number of ionizations have been registered by it, it terminates the exposure after a set amount of time, right? So we still need an optimum KV, and we also still need to set a appropriate MA, right? We still need an optimum KVP and an optimum MA. And that has to be set by the radiographer when we're using the AEC. So the first consideration that comes up when thinking about KVP is no amount of exposure compensates for inadequate penetration. This is looking on page 412 in our textbook. It's an important part here, and I've underlined it. If you're looking for a description of the brief description of how the AEC works, it's at the top of the page on 412, and then further down, almost close to the bottom, it says no amount of exposure can compensate for inadequate penetration, insufficient KVP. It didn't have enough energy to get through the patient. Okay, so we have to set that optimum KVP. Also, the MA needs to be high enough to minimize motion, but not so high that the exposure times are shorter than what's called the MRT, the minimum response time. A minimum response time. So all electronic devices require an amount of time for the signal input in order to operate, right? And you can think about it like this, like with your cell phone, you push the button and the screen comes on, right? If you don't continue on and do other things with the phone, the screen turns off, right? That is your cell phone's minimum response time. It needs some kind of input, or it's not just going to stay on indefinitely, right? The same thing is going on here with the AEC. It needs some minimum amount of time, basically, for it to be on, right? So if I set my MA too high, the problem becomes that I've basically exceeded the screen time of my cell phone, right? It's too much information inputted all at once, right? Minimum response time. So I could potentially overexpose the patient. That's not really a problem, though. In all honesty, that is more academic than anything. I don't think we need to know how to calculate minimum response time or anything like that he goes into. I don't want to get lost in the weeds. The big thing and the highly testable part of the AEC from these 3 points is probably dealing with the backup timer. The backup timer is the thing that we hit most often, right? And basically, what this is doing is it's setting a timer where if the AEC was misused, the exposure will be terminated regardless. It will stop the exposure even if it hasn't gotten enough ionizations through the ion chamber. Even if it doesn't have enough of a head count, it's going to stop the exposure. That's what the backup timer does. So we should never set it more than 2 times the expected amount of exposure time or mass, right? So basically this is saying don't have it higher than needing to irradiate the patient twice, right? So you might have misguessed or whatever. It's kind of a fudge factor, right? Say you miscalculated what the mass should be. Just make sure that it's not twice what you expect. The reason for that is simple. The AEC does not terminate the exposure until it's got enough of a head count. So if there's something going on that's interrupting the X-ray beam, like a good example from this chapter is, say the patient has a hip prosthesis. They have metal in their hip. They have hardware inside their hip. And that metal is now attenuating the X-rays. So I'm counting the X-rays exiting the patient, but a lot of them are being attenuated by the hip, right? It's not going to stop the exposure until it gets enough ionizations, right? But a lot of them, again, are getting attenuated by that metal hip. I'm going to fry the hell out of the patient before it stops, right? Unless I hit the backup timer. Then it's going to say, oh, that's enough. No hip should take more than that, right? So that's an example of why we need to be careful with these things and not just use them willy-nilly. There are instances in which we need to maybe reconsider whether or not we're going to use them, and the primary way to reconsider it is the backup timer. And the rule that he gives us for the backup timer is do not set it for more than 2 times the expected exposure timer mass. Yes?
You said the AEC won't stop the exposure until it has enough ionization?
Correct. Correct.
But if your backup timer will regardless.
Yeah, the backup timer will terminate the exposure even if it doesn't have enough ionizations inside the ion chamber. Okay, I'm going to show you all real quickly how this is applied and the way that this is generally tested, because what I just showed you is not necessarily the way that we don't need to memorize anything on that slide. What we need to be able to do is to think critically about this. So I'm going to draw a terrible pair of lungs. It's going to be the worst pair of lungs ever, right? And I'm also going to draw the AEC. And AECs are always in this triad shape. You've seen them on the image receptor, and they look like this. There's an ion chamber right here, an ion chamber right here, and an ion chamber right here. If you're a fan of the movie Star Wars, they look like the targeting system for an X-Wing fighter, right? Behind each one of these little red squares is where the ion chambers live.
You can't see anything.
Oh. So if I have an ion chamber here and an ion chamber here, but the ion chamber here is the one that I activate, the problem with this situation is it will burn out the lungs, but give me a very pretty picture of the thoracic spine. So the rule here is whatever piece of anatomy you want to get a picture of, put it over an activated ion chamber. But nothing in life is quite that simple. We also have some ways to manipulate this, and you will see technologists using this quite a bit. And what we call is the density controls. The density controls are kind of an imperfect system. They're kind of the best of all possible worlds, if you will. And it's on page 414 in our textbook. There's going to be some knobs or some buttons somewhere on the X-ray control panel. And I'll show you these once we get through this section. We'll walk over to the lab. I'll show you what I'm talking about so we're not confused on this. But you can push buttons on the control console that will make the picture brighter or darker, right? You can turn the AEC up or down, the number of ionizations up or down. And what you're controlling in that instance, those buttons are tied to that thyrotron, right? That releases the amount of charge from the capacitor, okay? So generally, in general, a change of +2 is needed for a higher exposure, and a change of -1 is needed for less exposure. I'm not interested in you memorizing this, right? You just need to understand that the density controls, because of the way density works, right? If you want to improve the picture, if you want it to be, if you want there to be a higher amount of exposure on the image, right? So there's greater amounts of darks on the image, less whites on the image, you would want to increase it by +2, right? If you want this to be less of an exposure, you only need to turn it down by 1. That's in general, right? But oftentimes, what the registry exams and things like that are more interested in, again, is just the critical thinking part to this. Like, what might be required for a patient, right, who I do the exposure, I didn't see what I need to do, here's a list of technical factors, I need to change something with the density controls, right? So it's generally given to you as a patient care situation, right? And you don't need to know, oh my goodness, did I do it 2 up or 1 down? That's just more for techs, something to keep under your hat as you're doing the work. So these things are not perfect. The AEC has some notable limitations to it, some of which I've already kind of outlined for us, okay? But the primary one that we run into over and over and over again is that the patient's not appropriately centered over the AEC ion chambers. If we haven't centered the patient appropriately, this can result in either overexposure or underexposure. I don't want to fall one way or the other too much. It could wind up being too much or too little, depending on how they are miscentered. We should not use AECs if the anatomy doesn't completely cover at least one detector cell, right? If it doesn't completely cover it. So an example like that would be like a finger or a hand. I don't need to use an AEC for this because I'm not completely covering the detector cell with my hand, right? So it would just result in an overexposure. This is in general why you mostly see these systems attached to the wall bucky, and you don't see technologists shooting like extremity work like a hand on the wall bucky, right? It's not just the what would you call it? The ergonomics of that. It's or how comfortable would that be for the patient or what have you. It also has to do with the use of the AEC.
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay, so at the VA they have digital, and a lot of times.
Okay. Be careful when you're using this, especially for pediatric patients, or when you're doing stuff up towards the margin of the body, like with a clavicle. We're about to look at that in procedures. Probably don't want to use an AEC for imaging of the clavicle. Why? Because if we're centered appropriately on the body of the clavicle, even if we've coned right, unless the person has very large shoulders, there's a chance that we could not completely cover the AEC detector with the area of interest. Some of the detector will be up over the shoulder, and we would terminate the exposure too soon. Okay? So probably don't want to use it for things like clavicles. We want to make sure that we collimate appropriately, because if we're just producing scatter inside the patient, not useful information, that could also artificially terminate the exposure. And we do not want to use it if the patient has any kind of hardware. By hardware, I mean any kind of surgical implant, metal, orthodontics, things like that. So anytime we're using an AEC, it is worthwhile getting appropriate patient history. Have you had any surgeries in the past? Especially, like I'm doing an x-ray of your hip. Have you had any hip work done in the past? Why am I asking them that? Well, I want to know whether or not I can still use the AEC for my exposure. Okay, we're changing gears just a little bit, and I've skipped forward to chapter 38, which is page 671 in our textbook, where it talks about portable stuff. And then I'll wrap up today talking about tomography. And then we'll transition to talking about just fluoro, all right?
You said 678?
What chapter?
671. 671, chapter 38.
38.
One thing that a big consideration to understand about using any portable machine that you have in the hospital setting is that the generators are almost always what we call a constant potential generator. Constant potential generator. What that means is never take a portable x-ray machine apart. It has a very large capacitor in it that would knock you into next week, right? That's how it works. It uses, charges up this capacitor, and then it gives off all of the energy all at once. So what we have going on when we make a portable x-ray exposure is direct current. We don't have to worry about any alternating current stuff. We just have direct current. We have the full thing, no ripple effect going on. No ripple effect. Almost 100% high power. So he talks about how in general that means we can reduce the amount of kVp that we use, right? Because that ripple does produce reduced efficiency in the x-ray production. But the main thing that I would expect y'all to understand is make sure that you keep your portable machines plugged in at all times that they're not being used. Plug them in for recharge, because that affects the efficiency of x-ray production. And then understand that portable techniques are different than the techniques that we generally use in the department. Okay, I'll say that again. You'll have to memorize in any facility that you work in, if you're doing portable x-rays, you'll need to basically know in the back of your mind There's two different techniques that can be set here, the techniques that are there in the department and the techniques that can be done on the portable. Okay? Now, the other part is with the portable x-ray equipment, there's more of a potential for operator error, right? We have more flexibility with imaging, which is good because we're trying to work portably with patients, and the patients sometimes are not very mobile, or they may be agitated or have trauma or whatever. There may be limitations on the patient side. There's also limitations on the operator side. And so that flexibility in imaging can lead to geometric distortion. We've already talked a little bit about the effects of distortion on our imaging. So the rule of thumb that he's given us comes from page 673 in our textbook, is that we should always keep the central ray perpendicular to the anatomy rather than the IR. So the classic example here is with the AP chest x-ray. We're trying to do this portably. We're in the patient's room and we can't get the bed to fully sit up right. We've slipped the image receptor behind the patient and we notice it's sitting at a slightly different angle than the patient is sitting, right? So we try to stuff some pillows behind it or something. We're trying to cobble together a good AP chest x-ray, right? As you're doing that and as you're angling the x-ray tube, just know that it is best to angle to the anatomy of interest, perpendicular to the anatomy of interest, than to the image receptor plate, right? If you have to choose, go with the anatomy of interest. So this is illustrated in figure 38.2 in our textbook. And then the final point, I think I've said it once already, is that technique charts are going to be machine specific. So if you have two different brands of portable at your facility, guess what? They're going to have two different technique charts on them because that CPG, that capacitor discharge unit, is going to be different on those different units. Okay, the final thing. So I'm switching gears yet again. I'm going to talk very briefly about something with you that is not in your textbook at all. And that is this tomographic techniques. And when I talk about tomographic techniques, I'm not talking about computed tomography. I'm not talking about CT. I'm just talking about x-ray machines that move while you're getting a single x-ray image. So there is one of these at Baptist Memphis that they use occasionally. That's what I'm talking about. Generally, what we're talking about when we talk about tomo is movement of the tube, and the IR may track with it slightly. So as the tube is angling, the image receptor may move slightly along with it. In general, we do not move the patient. This allows for blur, right? Anytime there's motion on an x-ray image, there's blur that occurs. But in tomo, what we're trying to do is blur out anything that superimposes what we're trying to see. So we're going to set basically a pivot point beyond which things will be blurry. Where this is particularly helpful and where we continue to see it quite a bit is in intravenous pyelogram. So we're trying to just see the kidneys. The kidneys are right there in the middle of the abdomen, right? So I'm going to draw a terrible picture of someone's abdomen, right? It's going to be in a sagittal view. This is a terrible kidney right here, more towards the patient's back than towards their front, right? And if I just take a straight-on x-ray of this, I'm going to get all of the guts in here. I'm going to get the spine in here. I'm going to get all this junk in there in a straight-on AP image. If I just take an x-ray like this, right, I'll get all of this stuff will be superimposing what I'm interested in, which is the kidneys, okay? So what I can do is rather than just take a straight-on image, I'm going to have the x-ray tube arc, right? It's going to move over the patient while it's taking this picture, right? So what I just did was, and the degree of that arc will set basically the pivot point where nothing's moving, because that's how a fulcrum works, right? What I'm talking about here is a simple machine where I've got this part is going to move a whole lot up and down, just like a seesaw. This part will move a lot up and down. This part doesn't, right? So just like seesaw at the playground, now I'm going to set the seesaw on the kidney. That's the part that I don't want to move. Everything else is going to go up and down. What I'm going to wind up with is a picture of just the kidney. Okay? So this blurs out the superimposing structures above and below the plane of interest. We set the anatomy of interest at the fulcrum, the point of no movement, and that will be the point of sharpest resolution. These textbook numbers no longer apply. So this is not found in your textbook anymore. I couldn't find it. The exposure arc is the amount of angle, so the degree to which the tube moves. The greater the arc, the thinner the image will be. So the more the tube moves, the thinner the picture just got, right? And the amplitude is the actual distance traveled by the tube. I wouldn't worry so much about that. I would focus on what this tomographic technique does. It blurs out the stuff that's superimposing the area of interest. The fulcrum point is the anatomy of interest, and the exposure arc sets the thinness of the slice, the thickness or thinness of the slice. So if it's a short exposure arc, like if I only move from here to here, the image will be thicker, right? If it's a longer exposure mark, it's going to be thinner, right? If you have those things in the back of your mind, you're good to go. You're golden, right? Every single tomographic unit that you could potentially work on will be different, and so you'll need a technologist to orient you to, this is the way that we do our measurements and things like that. Because what will happen prior to making this exposure is they'll have some kind of recipe that they'll follow where they place some calipers on the patient, they measure the thickness of the patient from front to back, right? And then they have some way of calculating exactly where the kidneys are at, right? They say that it's a third of the distance across the abdomen or something like that, right? Because they're basically retroperitoneal, right? So just know that when you get to a facility, if they're using the Tomo unit, ask them, okay, how do we set the fulcrum point on this machine? And you'll know enough to sound like you know what you're talking about.